Friday, October 18th, the day after one of the great collapses in Denver Broncos history, which we are torn between despair and just laughing out loud. So anyhow, financial markets. Rates are under some upward pressure because of good news. I know this sounds strange. No, I have not been drinking, not yet, but good news. First piece of it is Brexit. The people so fond of Europe and won Europe write really appalling things about Prime Minister Johnson. Only about half of them are true. But he has gotten Britain off of a 2-year terrible logjam, unable to do anything. A negotiated Brexit may be approved by Parliament within the next week or two, and if not, then likely elections in Britain, but it moves. And Europe moved, and Britain moved. And so interest rates all over Europe have risen because less fear that a crash-out Brexit would do damage to their economy. Secondly, Mario Draghi has been the diligent head of the European Central Bank now for half a dozen years. But he's become more of a caretaker than an action figure. He's done all that he can to keep the next European recession from being named after him, but European policy hasn't really changed at all since the last breakdown in 2012. The new head of the European Central Bank lands next month is Christine Lagarde, who for a time was a Chicago corporate lawyer, French of course. She's been the head of the IMF. She is enormously capable and respected and tends toward wanting to accomplish things rather than talking about things. There's a chance that Christine Lagarde will get the Germans off the dime of their mania for running a budget surplus and never spending any money or borrowing any. And for Europe to move forward, and for its economy to move forward, the Germans need to move, and that picture brightened also. Here, usually shooting somewhere in the world pushes money to bonds and pushes interest rates down, again because of fear. Whatever it is that's going on in Syria, it isn't so much good news as not bad news. The ceasefire agreement with Turkey appears to read, you can shoot anybody you want to and we'll get out as fast as we can, but no harm. There isn't anything of financial importance in either Turkey or Syria. So even though it's very unpleasant, there's no particular harm at hand. Then, more good news. The Fed meets on the 30th of October. The Fed, I suspect, is thrilled internally that the outbreak of news mentioned above has let it resume its hoped-for invisibility and pushed all Fed stories to page 4 where nobody reads them. The good news piece for the Fed has been a new deal with China, which of course isn't a deal at all. But there's enough political movement that it's unlikely that we're going to have another tariff spasm. It looks as though there's just a stand down between the United States and China. And it may not get better, but it's not going to get worse. And that's important. The weakness in overseas economies and the small weakness here in manufacturing and agriculture, which of course feels big to people in manufacturing and agriculture, but in the aggregate, not a big deal. That's going to let the Fed on the 30th decide, do we cut again for insurance or pass? But in either event, it's not such a big decision. There isn't any movement underway in the economy. It's just so steady in all reports. It's not accelerating, it's not faltering. It's sitting right about the 2% growth that the Fed has in mind. Another piece of good news. The Fed this year has abandoned the old theories involving unemployment too low as a reason to raise rates or worry about inflation. and also the productivity business, that productivity is not growing fast enough. And both of those theories are now not in play. The Fed is aware that the inflation rate in the United States is on the low side of all of their forecasts. It is not rising. Expectations of future inflation are low. All good. A brief excursion to politics, very carefully, don't want to offend anyone. Whatever the unquantifiable odds of Mr. Trump leaving office 2 weeks ago are higher now. We may suffer through a Senate trial, and I suppose the odds still favor acquittal, but the politics of the matter are changing. This is October. In 12 months, we're going to have an election. It has been easy for both parties to stay in denial and very much enamored with their bases, that is each party's base. And as the election draws closer, it has its own power. It's one thing for Republicans to be afraid of their base and to continue to support Mr. Trump, but it's something else entirely to run on the same ticket with him. The Democrats have found Trump convenient in their working theory, especially among the farthest left side progressives, has been all that's necessary is to be nominated. Anybody can beat Trump. A more likely exit for Mr. Trump, if it happens, is the Nixon route, where enough Republicans, especially in the Senate, go to him to say that it's time. And continuing the good news thread, I can hardly imagine anything more beneficial for both parties. If Mr. Trump left the scene, the Democrats would realize that they're actually going to have to compete with what might be an able Republican, and there are plenty of them, who would instantly be elbowing each other for their own party's nomination. It might have the effect, wishful thinking I know, of pushing both parties towards the center, to real conversations about what the country needs and what might be done, and the terrible, terrible word compromise. So I'm overflowing with good news. Have a good weekend.